I want to just share one more passage, then we'll talk a little bit about that, and then use some deconstruction to analyze the literature. So after our character hears the response from this truck driver, the truck driver says, well, it's called pyramid because the guy who named it thought it sounded good. And so that reaction is repeated in at least one other spot. But I thought we could just read another section here where Trout then reacts to that. And so he's an author, so he's thinking like an author and thinking about a story he might write. He sat back and thought about it. He shaped it into a story which he never got around to writing until he was an old man. It was about a planet where the language kept turning into pure music. Because the creatures there were so enchanted by sounds, words became musical notes. Sentences became melodies. They were useless as conveyors of information. Because nobody knew or cared what the meanings of words were anymore. So leaders in government and commerce, in order to function, had to invent new and much uglier vocabularies and sentence structures all the time, which would resist being transmuted into music. So that passage really jumped out to me, especially because of the character's analysis of language and his perspective at this moment. So one of the points of deconstruction is to take multiple angles, to find binary opposition. And we can do that very easily. Let's talk about it just sounded good. Well, perhaps Vonnegut here is trying to point out the absurdity of the removal of meaning of a word from its use. For example, calling a trucking company pyramid, something that doesn't move, assigned to something that moves constantly. Well, that's one perspective. Perhaps Vonnegut wants this character to show, and he is an author, he is an artist after all, that he is analyzing things in a different way, looking at a new perspective like artists might do. So that's one, okay? The way to approach it would be that the absurdity of the use of the word is rather absurd that he pointed it out in the first place. Is it really that surprising? That's how we do things? That we don't use words exactly as their intended use? And maybe it's more surprising that our character, Trout, actually takes the time to point it out. Is he really surprised? But that can give us some insight into the character himself, because he is a little removed from society. He didn't even know he had fans of his novels. And eventually does come to know that, but he's a little removed from society, so maybe it is surprising to him that people use words that way in an absurd way. So maybe that's another way to show an example of the character. But perhaps this author is trying to, the tragedy of his situation is being brought out. So a tragic hero, perhaps, towards the end of the novel, gets his finger bitten off in a confusing display of miscommunication and buildup of misunderstood people and ideas. And without getting too much more to that, because we're going to run out of time really quickly here, understand that these ways of playing in meaning of this one situation, this one scenario where he's talking about the sound of words and melodies, that can really come from several different angles. And the point of deconstruction is that you're not trying to prove one or the other wrong, but you're trying to set up these established binaries, these established systems, and then allow them to all be tied into the actual meaning that you can get from this. So it was a quick explanation of Vonnegut's book, at least not an explanation, but at least pinpointing one thing out of the book that jumped out to me. There are a few other things that I don't have time to get into, but simply the placement of the author, and as we said before, author is the subject, and there are several layers. You have an author who's writing about a person who's a narrator talking about an author, and at times they kind of shift in and out, and that kind of displaces meaning and sets up all sorts of multiplicities that deconstruction is very useful for. So while it ends in an interesting way, and I will again spoil it by explaining that it ends with a finger being bitten off, it does not spoil the book at all if you have not read it. And to give a little reader response version of literature analysis, I would highly recommend checking out some Kurt Vonnegut. I'm anxious to pursue some more and to see how some deconstruction might line up with that as well.